Welcome to the Thinky Doers podcast. Thinky Doers are those of us drawn to deep work, where thinking is working, but we don't stop there. We're compelled to move the work from insight to idea, through the messy middle, to find courage and confidence to put our thoughts into action. I'm Sarah Lobkovich, and I'm a Thinky Doer. I'm here to help others find more satisfaction, less frustration, less friction, and more flow in our work. My mission is to help change makers like you transform our workplaces and world. So let's get started. Hi, friends. I've been thinky-don'ting with this podcast for long enough, so I'm just going to get started today. Today, we're going to get in under the wire on the close of the first month of 2022 to remind you that you've probably got an annual plan or a big personal goal that you worked hard on at the end of the year when we did our look back on 2021 to plan 2022. We're not going to talk about goal setting today. Instead, we're going to spend a few minutes noticing whether you have actually made progress on the goals you set. And if you haven't, don't worry. It's actually really normal. I'm going to share a few simple tools here that I find help people get started on the behavior change necessary to make progress on goals, since that's the step we often miss. So now let's start in an often overlooked but really important place. Let's share some of the language that I'm going to be using today, and this carries over into future episodes. I'll try and do a good job here of defining the terms I use, because especially in goal setting, I find that lack of shared meaning about the words that we use, especially in collaborative goal setting, can be a really big setback. So we'll start here with just getting on the same page with a few words and meanings. All right, first, you're going to hear me talk a lot about OKRs, or objectives and key results. I've been working deeply with OKRs for years now. I first really sensed the need for something like that around 2016, and then dove in deep in 2019 when I was working with an agency and drew the lucky straw to build their first curriculum around coaching OKRs for a large enterprise client. Since then, I have trained nearly 2,000 OKR coaches in over 300 organizations worldwide, facilitated hundreds of hours of OKR workshops to help teams set, align, and achieve transformational goals. I am a huge OKR nerd. I spend a lot of my time working with OKRs, teaching OKRs, and helping people build their own skills and adapt OKRs to their environments, working with people and teams. And I'll say, with all of that, OKRs aren't a magic solve for all of your organization's problems. They're a tool that requires skill, practice, courage, and experimentation and learning to leverage successfully. So you will hear me talk about OKRs as one of the tools in the toolkit, and they're only one of the tools. So for folks who aren't familiar with OKRs, I'm doing a series in February on TikTok. You can tune in, and the very first question I'm going to answer is, what are OKRs? That's on the Sarah Lobkovich TikTok. I'll put a link in the show notes. But I also have an older blog post. It needs to be updated for sure, but it's a good starting place. So I'll put that in the show notes as well. That one's on sarahlobkovich.com. So it gives a decent introduction. For now, though, I'm just going to share a quick intro to what those words mean when I use them here, because there is a lot of buzz around OKRs, but not a lot of consistency. And even with my years of professional deep focus and practice, I'm still iterating and learning. So these are the definitions we'll work with for now. And I do reserve the right to update you with shifts in this language in future episodes. So first, OKR objectives. OKR objectives are clear, directional, inspiring statements of intent that describe the small number of big directions we aim to pursue together. And key results are the small number of most important and relevant objective measures of success that help us know whether we're achieving or progressing toward our OKR objective. So in our OKRs in the model I work with, we aren't talking about what we're doing. What we're doing goes in our action plans or our work plans. In the model I work with, anything that's measured in terms of percent complete is an action or activity. Again, that goes in our work plans. So ultimately, our OKRs help us clarify what our big picture objectives are and how we'll objectively measure our success in our key results. And that key result piece is what's quite different about OKRs than about other forms of goal setting. That's going to be a whole episode on its own, but that at least gives you words and meanings for this conversation today. There's one other concept I want to share with you before we dive in on these quick tips about why and how you and your organization might not yet be mobilizing around those big plans you had in mind before you took your holidays. And this is introducing the idea that we might have different layers of goals. And this comes from sports psychology and coaching. So in the sports arena, often there's a lot of focus on outcome goals, but this type of goal isn't limited to sports. There are big stretch goals. They are usually infrequently measured and often binary. So they're the big stretch goals that we're either winning on or losing on. And we might not control all the variables of whether we win or lose. So a few examples. Place in the top 5 in my age category in my Super G race. Write a best-selling book. Double our revenue in 2022. So remember that. We're going to talk more about these big stretch outcome goals in a bit. But there are 2 other type of goals that help us achieve those outcome goals or that help us improve the likelihood that we'll achieve our outcome goals. And those are performance goals and process goals. This is another place where different people use wildly different definitions, but I like to think of performance goals as the objectively measurable leading indicators that we're on the right track toward achieving our outcomes. They might blend measures that we have more or less control of, but we typically have more ability to influence progress on our performance goals over time. So if we're going to achieve that bestseller book outcome goal, supporting measures we might organize around are things like pre-sell 10,000 copies of the book prior to launch, podcast guest episode appearances that reach a total of 100,000 people, similar to our target audience. Self-assess your energy score weekly to make sure you're maintaining a healthy energy score while you work on the book so you can do your best work. And when I mentioned key results above, our key results are often a mix of a few big outcome goals and a number of performance goals that help us make sure we're maximizing our progress. So then with that, process goals describe our how. Our process goals are largely within our control. They describe the changes in our processes and SOPs, our standard operating procedures, by which we're going to increase our likelihood of success on that outcome goal. They also may describe planned activity or milestones that you must hit to achieve your goal. So for example, for our best-selling author in development, they might have process goals that are a mix of progress, writing 1 chapter a week, milestones, completing rough drafts of manuscripts by March 1st, and actions, building a plan for the book launch. But our key results, if we're in that OKR environment, our key results are going to lean more heavily on those performance goals that we mentioned earlier. It's not going to be as often that we're going to see process goals in our KRs. Our process goals are going to tend to describe activity that's going to be in our work plan. Okay, so this gives us some shared definition and structure to work with around a few key terms. We've talked about OKR objectives. We've talked about key results, those pre-planned measures of success. I also mentioned activity or work plans, and we've discussed the difference between those outcome goals, our performance goals, and our process goals. So this last bit brings us to the first thing to consider. If you're lagging on your motivation or ability to make progress on the goals you set. And this applies to people with individual or personal goals, and also to organizations looking back at their strategic plans that they set for the year that they might not yet be really activated to work toward, if they're not knowing where to begin or what to do next to maximize progress. So pull out that annual plan or your goal if you're working personally. And now what I want you to do is identify what you set according to the language we just learned. So take a look at it and then look at the language that we just learned and think about in your plan or in your goals. What type of goals are you actually focused on? What have you organized yourself around? Odds are, unless you're a goal super nerd like me, it's mostly full of big, multiple variable outcome goals that might only be partly within your direct control, and planned activities, often in the form of milestones or activity plans, more like those process goals we talked about a moment ago. So let's talk about the first type first. How many of those do you have? How many of those big outcome goals? How many of those races do you want to win this year? If you have more than 3 or 5, I'd encourage you to prioritize. For individuals, you can even start with one of those big goals. And if you must tackle more than one, try to do no more than 3. Please, it's too much. If you're an organization, you're going to do well to focus in on 3 to 5 of those big outcome goals, and we're going to call those our objectives for now. This doesn't mean the rest aren't important. It means that for right now, you need to focus on a reasonable number of goals, because when everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. Okay, so we've whittled down our outcome goals to a manageable number of objectives. That's progress. The next thing I want to do is coach you through forming some key results in the form of performance goals. But like I said, that's an entire episode's worth of content, and we're better off sticking to the schedule that I haven't taught you yet, where we set and locked our goals at the end of last year. So we're not going to even consider changing them until the end of Q1. So why is that? Because if we change our goals during the quarter, we're going to miss out on learning about what we can do better next quarter. So instead of setting new key results, let's just look at those planned activities or whatever milestones or activities you identified if you did set any. Those aren't key results unless they're objectively measurable. If they're a true objectively measurable target, like pre-sell 10,000 copies of the book prior to launch, then you do have yourself a key result and you can identify it as such. But odds are, if you're not an OKR nerd, you might see that anything you've set that isn't an objective is a process goal or a planned activity. So we can put those down under that title, whichever one works best for you. You can call them action plans, work plans, process goals, whichever one makes more sense to you. So now we've made some progress. You started out with something you were calling a plan or goals or resolutions or a strategy, and now we've increased your likelihood of success just through a little vocabulary lesson, since you're more aware of the nomenclature and characteristics of the goals that you've set. If you've only set outcome goals or objectives, then you might notice that your confidence and motivation to prepare might flag. And sometimes over-focusing on our outcome goals alone can lead to under or overtraining and injury in sports. It can also lead to apathy or lack of engagement or burnout at work. So if we've only set process goals or action plans, you again might find yourself struggling with motivation. What's the why when there's no bigger goal to ladder up to? I used to struggle with this big time between big climbing objectives. When I had a next big objective I was training for, I trained like it was my job. But the minute I went into recovery or maintenance training without a next big objective on the calendar, I would lose all motivation to even get off the couch. So if you have a mix of outcome goals and process goals, you may be able to motivate to stick to your plan. And that activity might be enough to help you feel like you're making progress. So keep at it if so. What you might find when we get to the outcome date and take stock, though, is that you checked all the boxes on your progress goals or your activity plans. And then you might still be surprised by your performance on your objective. Sometimes you'll surprise yourself in a good way, overshooting your objective entirely, which sounds great, and it might be if we're talking about a best-selling book. But if we're talking about that Super G race and your goal was to place in the top 5 and you smoked your age category and would have been competitive in the top 5 in expert, then that's not really the most ideal outcome. Sometimes, though, you might surprise yourself by underperforming. The book doesn't take off in its first week. You try hard in that Super G race, but the weather is worse than you expected. You wind up struggling just to finish, or your team did everything on their work plan and ultimately came in way below your revenue target. These misses aren't on their own a problem. Setting an objective is an experiment to see if we can achieve an exciting, uncertain outcome. And we can influence the result, but we don't control all the variables. But these misses do point to something we'll talk about in future episodes when we dive deep into those key results I mentioned earlier. Because all of those are examples of surprises when we get our final outcome measurement. So we'll talk about how this plays out in corporate environments later on, but a hint, it happens often and it can be very expensive. It also has been the case for a long, long time. I was reading a 2003 Harvard Business Review article the other day that quoted an executive describing annual planning as, "We pretend to make strategy and they pretend to follow it." And in many organizations, nothing's changed since that article was published. So for now, let's just know it is possible to increase our confidence and reduce the incidence of surprises at our ultimate performance stage, at our outcome goal stage, by setting true key results. So when we do experience those sensations of leading by hope or over-relying on projecting confidence when we're not actually sure about our progress, or any of the other pitfalls mentioned above, we increase our motivation to learn about key results before we set goals for our next quarter. For now, though, we're going to run this experiment this month without them, and we'll see what we learn. Okay, last thing. Now you've got your head wrapped around your objective and some work plans. There's one more step I'm going to ask you to take, and this is what's new. It's to actually form a plan for behavior change. Because right now, you may have established a habit around this goal. You might not be thinking about it that way. Maybe you're sticking to your plan, checking off those process goals, doing what you think you need to achieve that outcome. But given that it's the end of January, we are perilously close to when most Americans give up on the goals they may have set at the new year. A poll of 2,000 Americans found that it takes just 32 days for the average person to finally break their resolutions, and 68% report giving up their resolutions even sooner than that. And that's from a New York Post article. I'll put the link in the show notes. And if you're working with goals or plans in a corporate setting, odds are you haven't even gotten out from under your email after the holidays, much less started in on that big, audacious target that you might have the whole year to figure out how to achieve. So if you're in either of those camps, what you're ultimately running into is that really we have to change our behavior to change our outcomes. And changing our behavior is not easy. There's a book called Immunity to Change by authors Keegan and Leahy. Thank you, Coach David, for the recommendation. It's awesome. And that book shows that we struggle to make changes in our behavior even when it's a matter of life and death. So those authors cite a study showing that when doctors tell heart patients they will die if they don't change their habits, only 1 in 7 is able to follow through successfully. The status quo is so potent, it's hard to overcome, even when it's literally a matter of life and death. So those authors describe how our individual beliefs and our organizational mindsets create a natural and powerful immunity to change. There are also all sorts of areas where they're called set points come into play in human behavior. There's a theory in health and wellness on weight, for example, that theorizes that each of us and our bodies have a set point for weight, a weight at which our individual body is happy. And according to that theory, if you lose weight below that set point, you might actually feel hungry. Your body wants to return to its set point. And there's also a set point theory around happiness, that each of us has a relatively stable level of happiness, largely determined by our genes and personality. And that explains why when people win the lottery, they might be temporarily happier, but even winning the lottery doesn't confer a long-term kind of life-changing happiness that we think it would. An aside, there is some research indicating that mindfulness can shift our set point of happiness, so there's one more reason to meditate. But these examples illustrate it is actually really hard to change behavior. It's hard to change for humans, but it isn't impossible. So here is one of the tools that I find helpful in actually planning the behavior change part. And it comes from a book called The Coaching Habit by Michael B. Stanier. It's a great book overall. It's got lots of practical, easy to apply value and a whole bunch of questions that can help leaders make the shift from listening defensively, which they might not even know they're doing, to learning a question-based style of leadership that can reduce the calorie burn of leading and managing and increase ownership and solution orientation among their reports. I love how simple and widely applicable that approach is, and one of the tools the book teaches is a habit builder that I've found super helpful. We are often aware of the habit or behavior we want to change, but we don't always see the opportunity coming to make that change. So we're not always as aware of the triggers for our habits. So we just find ourselves in our habitual behavior, sometimes getting upset with ourselves that we're doing exactly what we promised ourselves we wouldn't do. So this habit builder is really helpful because it lets us identify, first, what's the trigger that we're going to watch out for? Second, what's the old habit that we're going to break? And third, what's the new behavior that we'll exhibit? So the trigger might be a location, a time, an emotional state, a person, some condition or operating reality. But when we identify a trigger, then we can see it coming and we can remind ourselves that when that thing happens, we're going to consciously choose our new behavior or habit. So to give an example, in a personal goal setting situation, a habit change plan might be something like, when I ignore my 9 a.m. timer and notice I'm still sitting on the sofa scrolling Twitter instead of starting my podcast research like I scheduled. Instead of abandoning my research plan for the day and just postponing it, I will set a 10-minute timer. When that timer goes off, I'll get up and get immediately to work. So that trigger, instead of I will then kind of structure, helps us structure those changes in behavior, gives us a way to see the opportunity to make the change, and then to actually do the replacement behavior that we have planned. You'll find more on this method at the Box of Crayons website. I will put that link in the show notes as well. But that simple habit builder is really helpful because that trigger, old habit, new habit plan can literally fit on a sticky note. And that's not a joke. That's usually where I put mine. That structure comes in really handy in corporate settings, also for helping teams think about desired new outcomes or what kind of organizational behavior they want to see change, which takes a little bit of creativity. So I do find that structure helpful there as well. The whole book is a great, fast, useful read. Highly recommended if you're looking for a bit of structured help around both building a toolkit to coach your teams and also becoming your own best coach. All right, team, that is way more than enough for one episode. So thank you for joining today and for hanging in there with me through those words and meanings. I would love to hear from you about what here resonated and where you might have gotten stuck or confused. And also, if there's anything you have questions about. You can find me at Sarah Lobkovich everywhere. It's a mouthful, but it's Sarah, S-A-R-A, Lobkovich, L-O-B as in boy, K-O-V as in Victor, I-C-H. Yes, I spell it a lot. Sometimes I even misspell it myself. And then my email address, you can use sarah@thinkydoers.com. I would be thrilled to have you as an email subscriber. For infrequent, more formal, strictly business messages, you can subscribe at redcurrentco.com. Or I've got a more personal list that takes side trails into topics around well-being, mental and emotional health, my race team life, and other serendipity at sarahlobkovich.com. You'll find show notes and a transcript for today's episode at thinkydoers.com. So thanks again, folks. Now set yourself a 10-minute timer, give yourself a few minutes to chill, and then when that timer goes off, get up and write yourself one habit change plan, and then email me. You don't have to tell me what your habit change plan is, but if you send me an email or direct message me to let me know that you did, I'll invite you to a little side community for a bit of personal accountability support to help you achieve that habit change. So again, you can reach me at sarah@thinkydoers.com. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I can't wait to hear from you, and I'll see you back here in February.